This is the Sustainable Goat Podcast.
We look to nature for how we should interrelate to the world. All the answers are within nature if we take the time to listen.
But what we have to find is a reasonable way how to handle plastic.
You know, consumers expect more. They're expecting brands to be more sustainable. They're choosing sustainable brands.
These are the stories and ideas from those that will define a generation. I'm your host, Steve Cassinem, and this is our planet in focus. So, David, I'm really excited about the conversation that we're going to have today. So, I mean, for me, construction's kind of been an area that I've wanted to focus on with Sustainable Goat because I guess the topic itself, I feel like, is very misunderstood. There's a lot of layers that go into construction. I think people think that a building is there, but how much water is it consuming? What's the material, the shipping, and then what's between the walls? And that's why I'm excited to have this conversation with you. But I wanted to start with just a question about your life in general. What got you into construction kind of in the beginning? Because it is a unique area to get into.
Well, it's been more than construction. I've been focused for maybe the last 25 years on how to build better, innovation. And there's been so much innovation in materials in general, but if you just take technology, but it really hasn't found its way into construction because then if you boil it down, in many ways, we still build with sticks and bricks, So about 25 years ago, I helped finance a mine in Zimbabwe, and we had to build 1,100 houses. And here's the finance guy having to go build 1,100 houses, and it was going to be out of blocks and literally a 10-shed roof, and it just didn't seem right. So that started me on my path, which has led me into we're now in a company called Rok-On Building Systems, but this is the second major company I've helped get going on various technologies to try and just find a path where using material science to provide better solutions rather than to lower the cost of construction to make it more rational. So I've been doing this for about 25 years now. We own a company called Rok-On Building Systems, which we'll probably talk a little bit about, but it's focused on material science and trying to put the latest and best materials into the business of construction to actually increase the sustainability and lower costs and make buildings better.
Yeah. Well, in construction, I think a lot of people think you see like a modern building, right? A skyscraper, something that's been built by architects and that whole process of like building something that's for the future. But the way that building is done, as you mentioned, is still like very much old school. And I feel like construction as an industry is always, I'd say almost like 10 years behind where society is. Is that because the builders are they're wanting to kind of go forward or something, but they have regulations in there? Or is it more just, it's just the way it's always been done, so why not keep going?
I think there's a lot of that. There's many different parts of construction too. There's commercial and residential, and there's apartments and house. So it's sort of a difficult, each has its own little thing. But I think in general, you would say that the machine is set up so that it's built with a bunch of layers and multiple subcontractors. And if you're a developer and you have a relationship with your subcontractor, you know what the costs are. The mortgage company's comfortable with the way of construction. The building inspectors are comfortable with all of this. So the barriers to change are pretty high because the system has been set up to really restrict innovation. I mean, down to the point where, building codes really are being used. We'll talk about this, I'm sure, but to enforce new concepts for sustainability. But the major companies that provide the building materials, they're the ones that have their representatives on the code compliance committees that are writing the codes, right? So it permeates its way into a lot of things. But generally, I would just say it's a resistance to change because it's easier just to go the way it's been going. And as long as you meet the code, you can get it done and everybody understands it. There's liability issues. So when you take on a $20 million commercial project and you have a new material, like we produce exterior insulated sheathing. So what are the liability issues of taking on that project, right? So it's just easier to do it the way it's been done. And that's why that's one of the reasons innovation has been really slow to adopt.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think one of the fascinating things about this is that, so when I create films or anything on that end, you almost see the world in a different way as you start to integrate yourself deeper and deeper into the world of your specialty. for you, did you kind of start looking at buildings differently, like how they were constructed or how they could be? I mean, I would imagine there's a level of that understanding of how buildings are put together where you start to almost see it everywhere and where the opportunity really is.
Well, okay, so for sure, you look at buildings the way they're being built. If you take a typical residential home built out of wood framing lumber and then insulation and then sheathing, you have drywall, you have all these layers, okay? So it just makes sense to see if there's a way to use the latest materials to try and reduce the complexity of construction and improve the performance of the wall. The problem with that whole thing, which is that you do have to live in the real world, right? And the real world is you have subcontractors that have to install this stuff. You have building inspectors that have to be able to inspect it. You have to have designers that can design with it. You have to have a whole number of layers of considerations on how you're going to introduce this, particularly if you're going to have any commercial success. You could do a house here or there, but if you're going to try to really get something into the market, it's not that easy. Just to give you an example, right? If you want, for us, we make a structural insulated sheathing. So our product goes on the exterior of a wall that provides insulation and sheathing all in one step. Okay, well, there's a lot of things that we could talk about, but just to be able to provide our product into the market, we have to have a certification that the testing that we have is actually being produced through a plant that's quality controlled. So you have to then make the investment in the plant. Okay, you have to have the quality control system. You have to have paid the testing agencies. You have to pay the people that are going to monitor your quality controls. Then you have to have a product liability insurance policy, which relies on all of that to be able to have, before you're ever even able to bid for a project, right? Wow. So the investment in time and capital is pretty high. And what's been happening is that the large companies like the major building product suppliers, which you know all the names from Home Depot, they have multi-billion-dollar investments in their production and in their materials. And so it's much easier for them to, let's say you want to increase energy efficiency in a house and put some insulation on the outside of the walls. It's much easier for them just to add another product on top of the ones they're already selling. And then you have to protect it for water. So they add another product. So now they have 5 or 6 different SKUs and opportunities to sell. But all that does is create complexity and more cost and more waste in the building, right? So to get to a point where you're actually able to realistically be a solution is a long and complex and costly effort.
Wow. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of steps I know that go into building. I mean, even from the permitting side, you have a lot too. And that's even before you guys even start entering the picture in terms of being an option for the bid too. And I just feel like there's all these points where there's opportunities to change. And I think the industry is starting to shift a little bit. From your perspective, I mean, is it an inherent need to change? Meaning like from the builder's perspective, are they seeing that there is like a drive from the consumer side to kind of want to maybe build stuff differently or use different materials? Because they may not be cost effective at the moment, but I would imagine the grand scheme of things, it does totally make sense because you're almost investing in longevity.
Well, I think there's sort of 2 components to what you're saying. First of all, I don't think there's any industry that's more in need of change from a sustainable standpoint than construction. I mean, 40% of all the energy produced goes out the walls because of poor energy efficiency. And then landfill waste is the construction landfills, 40% of all the landfill waste. It's by far the largest contributor to landfills. So it's needed for sure. When you have all these different materials and you have designs where it's cut to, 9 foot, 3 3/4 inches instead of, let's say 10 feet, which divides 4 by 8 by 2, it's not rational. You have a lot of waste. So what's happening, and then on the energy efficiency side, clearly the governments around the world recognize that this is a big issue, right? Energy conservation in some rational way to produce energy for the population is important. And what's happened is building codes are being changed to increase more energy efficiency and introduce it into the building by code. So these mandates are beginning to drive change in terms of how the building industry has to react. I mean, you have to meet the codes to get a building permit. So it does have a major impact, and that's a positive step forward. And they're increasing changes. The codes that were put in 2016 are now being updated in 2021. Before, you didn't have to have residential construction. Now you do, pretty much, for a large part of the country. So this is an ongoing thing. It takes a long time to introduce, but it's happening. So yeah, so the building codes are helping to drive change. And we really do need it in construction.
Yeah. Well, and from where you sit in the industry, I mean, you've seen construction develop, because I almost think you see markets shift in a timeline. You have the technology sector shifts, and then the real estate sector will shift. In terms of construction, is this one of the bigger ones that you think you've seen in kind of your career? Because I think with materiality more specifically, it is opening the door for just so many more options than I think ever before.
Well, for sure, there's a major shift underway. Okay. And it's coming from two or three things. I mean, more recently, you talk about the pressure from consumers. The architects who are now designing these buildings are very much into sustainability, right? So you now, if you even want to get specified into buildings, have to have an environmental product declaration and provide all of this information about your footprint, sustainable footprint. So there is a lot of pressure on the part of the industry to respond to sustainability, and it is driving a lot of the change right now. So the other thing that's happening is that because of the requirements for code mandates and the costs associated with meeting those mandates in a traditional construction project, there has been a push to say, okay, well, how do we change the way we build to be more rational? And if you look at the automobile business or other things, prefabrication and providing component parts instead of piece by piece building it on site as a custom home pretty much every time. That is well underway. You've had the design systems, the AutoCAD and the software to be able to design allows, and many companies are working in and around that software to provide additional opportunities to prefabricate buildings. And billions of dollars are being invested in that in many forms. Modular construction and how you put together these modules to build buildings. So it's definitely underway, and it's a major push right now. And it's being driven by codes, being driven to take out the layers, being driven to make your designs more rational to fit with the construction materials out there and constructability. And the pace of this has really just started. I mean, it's probably 2 or 3 years, 4 years in, 5 years, but it's really underway right now in construction.
Well, and where you guys sit in the material side, what have you guys developed as a product for home? Because obviously prefab does play into every single one of this is about efficiency and optimizing the supply chain and making your product super resilient. So where does kind of Rok-On fit into the whole thing?
Well, if you just take a typical building, you have to put on a frame, then you have to put on an exterior sheathing for structure. You have to protect that sheathing from fire. You have to protect that exterior from water penetration. The codes now require you to put continuous insulation on the outside of your studs, because studs are like a radiator. They transfer energy very efficiently into your building. So the codes now require, if you will, a blanket around the outside of your building. Oftentimes those materials, it's usually typically foam or mineral wool, now try and put a finishing system on there. You can't screw into it. It's not going to hold anything. So what we've done is we've developed a structural insulated sheathing. We produce a fiberglass reinforced ceramic cement board that doesn't burn. It doesn't rot. It's not affected. Termites don't eat it. It's extremely strong, but it's cut easily with regular materials or saws, and it accepts all the common construction materials. And we laminate that to foam, and then we create a structural insulated sheathing, which is just screwed on in one step. And what it does is it, in one simple method, allows you to meet the codes for continuous insulation in a way which it is very strong structurally, ideally set for prefabrication, and you can apply your finishes directly to it. And so in a typical home, what might take you 6 or 7 or maybe 10 steps, we're down to 2 or 3. Wow. So it's much faster. And at the end of the day, it's much higher performance material so that you have better long life performance. It's totally recyclable. From a sustainable,
Wow.
we have lower carbon footprint. We've really focused on all of that because that's in our DNA. So we're experiencing tremendous growth right now because the industry is demanding our solutions because of codes, and we have the lowest cost alternative in the
Wow.
market, or among the lowest cost alternatives in the market.
Well, and I mean, just thinking about going through that many steps, you're cutting also the manpower and the man time that's kind of needed to put a structure together. And then you give it the flexibility of being able to do it inside a structure in the prefab space. And now you have basically a scalable solution. What's so unique about the material? I mean, obviously, like part of it is the way you guys construct it, of course.
Right.
But it's almost like one of those ideas of like, why hasn't this been found before?
Well, let me say it. I'm going to maybe shift a little bit away and say it this way. I've been involved in fiberglass sandwich panels and all sorts of different exotic materials, right? And there's a lot of things out there that are fantastic. But at the same time, you do have to live inside the current industry, right? You can't be too far afield from, I'll just take 3D printed homes, for example, okay? There's a lot of enthusiasm about that. Well, great, but now try and have your electrical inspector come in and inspect that wall. Okay, have the electrician how do you put the plugs in the wall, or those types of things. So when we went down this road, we've already fought those battles in many respects with other things that we've been involved with. So we focused on a sheathing that was very commonly used, although we increased the performance of the material substantially. So the way in which it's used in construction is very common, and it doesn't require the inspectors to get in, come in and how. That was a major part of our approach. The second part is that the materials out there for insulation are evolving. Foam plastics are under pressure. They're the most common things right now because they're the lowest cost, and that there's a big industry. So we're bringing on some new innovations in foam or insulation, non-combustible insulation that's very sustainable. That combines with our board products when we laminate together to create a fantastic sustainable production. But again, the reality is our products were developed with the idea of how do we reduce the layers of construction, but also fit inside the world of construction, because without that, you will not have any large scale adoption. You're going to try and change it too much.
Yeah. And I feel like when you're looking to solve a problem in the sustainability space, right? I think a lot of it comes down to the simplicity of it. How do you remove that friction for whatever market you're trying to fit in? And I think that's kind of what you hit on is really important, because it's not about completely upending the system, even if that's the end goal. It's about coming at it being like, we understand your pain points. Here's our solution, and let's find a way to develop this together. Because I think even talking about the insulation side, is there a scalable solution quite on the market yet? And if there isn't, you guys are at least working to get there. And I think part of that story of sustainability is the fact that it's a process and it's not entirely up to you guys.
Definitely it's a process because, again, we're talking about the entrenched interests and the barriers to entry into the real world of construction, right? So it's definitely a process. And as I mentioned, it's definitely requires a lot of investment in time and money to be able to even get into the market on a scale. But that's happening. There's a lot of products out there that are coming through, and the pace of technology is there because people are looking at sustainability. They are looking at building performance, and there are a number of solutions out there, that are coming.
On the insulation side, what's kind of some of the leading alternatives, if you will, to foam right now that would actually kind of make sense?
Well, we've looked at a lot of them. Okay. So there are natural solutions like hemp and those types of things. They've got hemp products in the market. Our approach was to go for a foam that's based on cement, okay, that doesn't burn. It has high insulation values. It's produced in a totally non-toxic way. It was basically developed by some people in Germany that are in the biochemistry industry. So it's really a biotech product, to be honest with you, where we reduce the carbon footprint by 90% over concrete. It's totally recyclable. It is essentially turning one of the worst carbon emitters, which is concrete, into one of the best insulators that you can have. So there is some innovation in terms of how you put together the foam systems. There are things like vacuum insulated panels, which are phenomenal, right? You can get an R60 wall with a 1-inch vacuum panel, right? But the problem with that in construction is you can't penetrate that at all. So how do you nail it onto a wall? Or if somebody puts a picture in and punctures it, those are difficult. But those innovations are coming, right? The costs generally are very high in the beginning. And there's a huge barrier or resistance to use high cost solutions in construction. Everyone's got a budget.
Yeah.
But the innovation's coming in insulation because the whole idea right now, if you think about it and you have a wall that's a 2x4 wall plus continuous insulation, the codes require you to have an R20, for example. Typically, right now, it's 2 inches of foam plus some cavity insulation, the fiberglass that goes between your studs and covered with drywall on the inside. Well, those systems have been proven over time to create problems with mold and water, getting inside the walls in various climates. And so if you could put all the insulation on the outside of your wall and not have to put the cavity insulation in, you're going to solve a lot of the problems relating to mold and water damage over time in a building. So there's a lot of focus on that at the moment to try and get the energy efficiency on the outside of the walls, but in a rational way. And that's what we're focused on as well.
Yeah, I think that's from a mold standpoint and a longevity of a building standpoint. I mean, that's one of the things I noticed when I was in Colorado. When I first moved here, it was coming from California, you can build at any time of the year and it's no big deal, but you come to Colorado and there could be snow on the ground and it's sitting on all the raw materials. And to me, not even thinking about the mold side or any other type of effect, it was just that wood generally warps when it gets wet. And so it's like you're putting not straight wood in a house. And to me, that didn't make sense. And so it began kind of my questioning of how construction was always done. And what it sounds like is you guys have kind of landed on something that has a way better process, but also way better product. Because I think from the sustainability standpoint, that's huge on the concrete side. I mean, I think a lot of people forget that construction actually is one of the biggest users of water of almost every industry. And a lot of that goes to concrete. And so it's like, if you can take that and shift it into something that can be used again in the process, it basically creates a circular cycle, which can be positive.
The other thing for us is that we fundamentally believe prefabrication is a solution, right? You take layers of subcontractors. Every subcontractor has a profit and an overhead and an admin cost. So that you start layering this number of subcontractors, it really does have an impact on affordability, to be honest. That's a major issue. And on-site construction is scarce. It's high cost. So if you can find a way to take those into a prefabricated setting off-site, you can have a big impact on cost. The other part is that now when you go to the job site, to your point about weather, you can enclose a building very rapidly. We've done hotels where when we're closing the 5th floor, they're already done with the 3rd floor because we're able to put in the windows and everything else. And we put the system up, our products up. The velocity of construction really improves, which is money. So we really focus on prefabrication. And in the real world, when you're thinking about doing large assemblies, let's say 25 feet long, right, 14 or 15 feet tall or whatever, those are pretty heavy. And when you move them around, if you don't have the right material, the sheathing can break, or if you want to put windows in, you can't put windows in because the flex in the system, when you move, it's going to break the window. So our systems are so strong that allows us to do a lot of these large assemblies. We've done assemblies that are as high as 35 feet tall, 14 feet wide with 2 windows in it, and done 2 stories at a time with no breakage. Okay. So, so if you think the simple things like even putting the water protection, the flashing around the window, you're doing it inside a factory. You're not up on a scaffold or a cherry picker 4 floors up. All of those things go to improve the building. So prefabrication is coming in a large way.
My understanding on the prefabrication side is a lot of it is strained by the transportation side of it, getting the final product to where it needs to go.
Correct.
Obviously, the navigation around bridges and all the kind of things come into consideration.
Yeah.
To me, I think part of that is providing a solution for that transportation system to be more seamless, because it seems like a way safer way to do construction too, because your crew is actually in a more controlled environment. And then you don't have all the weather factors to deal with. Is that kind of the funnel, though, that's in prefabrication being able to get at scale, or is it more like public adoption?
I think it's less about public adoption. You're totally right about transportation because the size of your components have to be limited by what can go down the road for sure. Think of that more as a design issue, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you can rationalize that in the design of your building, there's two basic approaches, and we call it 2D and 3D. So a three-dimensional would be a full modular. Think of it as a mobile home, right? That may not be a home, but goes in modules to put together, let's say, a dormitory.
Mm-hmm.
We've been involved with 5 and 6 story dormitories where they just have these 165 modules that go together to put this building together. The problem with those is, of course, they do have to go to the highway, but the throughput of putting out 4 or 5 of those modules a day, down to where the drywall's in and the washer and dryer's in the closet,
mm-hmm.
the throughput's pretty limited, really. It's going to be a small portion of the overall construction market, really. Mm-hmm. And the other part about modular buildings is that the financial industry hasn't caught up. Right now, if you do a construction loan, you have an inspector who says, I received my drywall today and I release the funds to be paid. But when they're in the prefab business and the modular side, 85% of those costs are being funded up front. And it's very hard for the financial industry to get behind some of these things because the risk that they're taking on with a single supplier and all of these things has been challenging for the guys that are pioneering this market, right? That's a big issue. We focus on the two-dimensional side, which is, think of just flat walls, okay? And we can put a lot of things in our walls. We can put in the windows, and we could put in the electrical outlets, and we can do the framing, and we can put our products on the outside. And in some cases, we have even finished the outside so you get fully finished pieces, right, that can go down the road. Mm-hmm. So if you think about designing around that type of system, then that's our approach because we think it has a much broader application in the market. And there's been a lot of innovation in, like, for example, steel framing, roll forming equipment that you can design. There's no waste at all. The studs are cut exactly to what your requirements are for that wall, right? It's not like you take a 2x4 and cut a 10-footer into 9 3/4 or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So the ability to adapt that into the design of your buildings has rapidly improved. So there's a lot of innovation coming that way. That's our focus has been on two-dimensional designs of wall systems that can go down the highway perfectly and use the materials performance to increase the ability to do those with the farthest along we can inside the factory.
Yep. And I think another approach that I've noticed has been obviously the container approach. How do you take containers, stack them, mold them together, whatever you need to do to kind of make the structure you need? Obviously, those transport a bit better, but don't you kind of run into some of those insulation issues and energy issues, stuff like that? What I find fascinating of the transportation side of prefab is that challenge itself. Because if it's never going to be cost effective to do for the end user, whether that's a construction company or a single person wanting to build something, then that market won't really be as viable.
Totally agree with you. The containers, at the end of the day, to get an energy code compliant product is more challenging than just cutting or putting a container and cutting a hole in it for a window. So it's proven to be more challenging than people realize on the surface. So it's not had a broad introduction. Even many people are trying and have done it. The transportation issue, again, is important. But again, if you had a 53-foot long truck, but you can go 8 feet wide, you can do an awful lot, right? So there are a lot of things you can do with just designing the wall systems in the rational way. Normal floors are 10 feet. So if you're on a flatbed, you can put it 14 feet. You can go through under most every bridge. So if you just do your designs right, you're able to do this pretty well. And the other part of it is that a lot of innovations coming or a lot of efforts coming in pods. Okay. So if you look at the construction of any home, the bathrooms, the kitchen, the water, the electrical, all of that typically, if you design it right, can be done inside a single pod that might be able to fit on a back of a trailer. And make that your foundation where that's a large portion of your cost, and then just put the 2D walls around it. There's a lot of effort into that type of 3D, combining the pod, the electrical, water requirements in a building with other components that can rapidly be put together and to help you on the transportation side.
So on the state side, obviously you also have some acceptance in terms of prefab going into building sites? Because I know some counties, they're hesitant to kind of go about that. What states are you guys finding are ones that would be a bit more progressive in a way of being like, hey, let's think about this differently?
Well, if you're going through the modular, I mean, you have to have inspectors in your plant and all of that. So there's a whole, call that a road tax, but there's a whole challenge of getting states to approve those plants to actually deliver that kind of product. For us, we've never had a problem at all with any local official. It's most often been the site conditions. If you're doing a high rise and with no parking on the side of the building and you're bringing trucks in, those are the types of things that we deal with. But, we've done a lot of high rise buildings, and actually prefab does help in many respects because oftentimes you don't have the space to do a normal construction and still meet the energy code requirements with continuous insulation on the outside. So if you can bring a prefab section in, you actually are solving a problem as opposed to having to deal with it. So we've never had a problem with the states on any of the stuff we've done, because most of the stuff we do is related to inspections, is inspectable on the field. Although we do sell a lot of our product to the modular builders, right? Because in our case, they're able to get into, by simply putting our sheathing on, they don't have layers of stuff that they have to put to make this code compliant wall. So now if you're talking about a factory that has a $55,000 a day cost, if you can take 2 or 3 days out of that production cycle, that's real money. So that's what we do. And we sell a lot of product in pre-cut, prefabricated pieces. So if they have a build order of a certain module and they're going to build 27 of these and they're rolling them down a line, we're able to provide a specialty part that is already pre-cut. They just screw that on the wall and they're into finishing it in the next 10 minutes, as opposed to waiting days to get it done by the layered systems. So we do a lot of business with the 3D modular producers.
That's huge. Do you feel like it's commercial or residential kind of leading the way in terms of new construction ways? My first thought would be commercial, and then I feel like it has a trickle effect, but not quite sure.
For sure, it's commercial. If you're a hotel owner, the energy efficiency over time is huge, more than the cost of the materials to increase it in the beginning. Over 10 years, it's a huge payback. So commercial has been more willing to move things forward. Residential, typically, especially with affordability right now being so low, it's really, how do I get the product out there at the lowest cost? And so a lot of the code requirements for continuous insulation were not applicable to residential construction below 3 stories, for example. So you could still build the old way. That's changing now. The 2021 codes are requiring it in zone 4, which I think everything above Texas is going to have continuous insulation. So that's starting to change in residential. But up to this point, it hasn't really permeated into it. The architects are really more interested in it, but at the end of the day, the drive for affordability is the paramount thing for on residential.
Yeah, is that kind of the deciding factor, I guess, in a lot of this? Is that when you decide to run a company a different way or build a building a different way, obviously there's inherent like a little bit of risk in it because you guys kind of are the pioneers. Is there a deciding factor in terms of the profitability? Is there a tipping point where suddenly it's like, well, of course we have to make this decision because it's easy? Is it necessarily from the code side, or is it also from the actual monetary side that can make it financially viable?
I would say it's as long as you're meeting the codes, it's the monetary considerations that are the most important ones generally.
Yeah.
It's really tough to innovate because you are up against all of the barriers with the building departments and the envelope engineers and the architects, and then the liabilities that they're taking on. And then it even goes down to where, in our case, we're a substrate for, let's just say, a cladding system. Think of it as like if you look at an auto dealer and they want to have aluminum panels on the side, or you want a certain paint. Well, those paints are warranted. So do they go on your substrate or not? So now we've had to go through all the testing with the material suppliers who are going to put stuff on ours so we can get the pass-through warranties to provide to the builder, right? So once you pass all those hurdles, you have to pass enough to have a certain amount of, give yourself enough credibility in the market to get people to use you in a broader scale, right? The construction velocity from our standpoint means an awful lot. I mean, if you can build a hotel and you can save 90 days in the construction of that, well, let's just say you have a $500,000 bid for the exterior of that building, they'll make $600,000 in the additional revenue stream because they're in 90 days earlier. So they basically got the walls for free. So construction velocity is a big thing. Warranty liabilities, big thing. Another right now is insurance. I mean, in California, good luck trying to get insurance if you are building with combustible materials.
Yeah.
It could cost you more than your mortgage.
Wow.
So that's starting to drive a lot of change in California as far as materials go.
Wow. Okay. That makes sense. And I think your company's approach of really attacking the time and really the labor side of it, meaning like how many people you need to put it together, how you guys can put it together remotely. I think that part's kind of huge. What's kind of been the favorite project that you've worked on, or at least most impactful that you've been able to be a part of?
We've done dozens of large commercial projects from 14-story condominium apartments. We have a number of projects going downtown New York City. We're doing dormitories. So we've done hospitals. So I can't tell you that the most impactful project, but typically the ones that we're involved with are starting more on the prefabrication side. And those are somewhat challenging because there's a lot of design in the front. We worked with one modular company where we had plan set number 17 because you're trying to get everything to line up and so those things are challenging. When they finally get together and it goes up in the time it does, that's really rewarding.
Yeah. What's been kind of the favorite part for you along the way of building it?
We've put a lot of energy and effort to get to this point, right? So the favorite part for me is just watching it go up and go, right? We've done projects where we've done pre-finished wall assemblies with stucco on the exterior. We did a 7-story hotel where we closed it in 42 days, and they had a 6.5-month build schedule before. We just did another dormitory for University of Iowa where we built a floor in the factory every 4 days, and then they took those panels out and built the floor on site in 4 days. And it's an 11-story building. Those things are impactful, right? And to be involved from the beginning of those projects, where through the design and then through the implementation is really rewarding. And at the end of the day, we know that they're getting a better building because it's not going to burn, it's not going to rot, it's highly energy efficient. Most of let's say the hotel projects that we've been involved with, a number of the guys, they own multiple hotels. And so, you do the energy study 3 years on, and, we're the lowest cost energy in their portfolio. Yeah. So we did a project where they shifted from, they were building residential, which was wood frame, usually 3-story, the 3-story walk-up apartments that you see everywhere. We were able to convince them to think about our product on steel frame. And so on the same piece of dirt, which is a big cost component, they went 6 stories, and they went from $100,000 a month in their course of construction insurance because of fire risk to $17,000. Wow. So, and you have an 18-month build out, and we saving them $100,000 or $90,000 a month. And the cost of our thing was $450,000, right? So they had a 3-to-1 payback just on the insurance during their course of construction.
Wow.
So those things are really rewarding. We don't get credit for that typically. Those are the hard things, because here's another challenge, right? All of those things which add to the value and the sustainability and all these things that are important really in the world we're living in. When they're doing construction budgets, those don't really care, right? Those are things that are sort of additive. We don't need a scaffolding in many cases because we can fly these things up with a crane. So there's another huge savings in time, especially in a winter environment. So we don't get credit for that when the specifiers are putting the construction budgets together. So that's the challenge that we have to try and educate the market on what we're doing. But a lot of our business is repeat business, because once these people have figured it out and they go through one successful project, they're using us on everything they do.
Yeah.
Which is driving our growth a lot right now.
Yeah. I mean, you guys are definitely on a huge upswing right now. Do you feel like you nailed the timing in terms of when? Because you talked about there's a timing for it to fit in. Do you guys feel like you nailed it, or were there times where it was kind of like, ooh, I don't know if we can pull this off? Should it have been a few years later or a few months earlier?
Well, I think going back a little history, I think we absolutely nailed it. We used to just sell our board as a sheathing. Okay. So it was on super sheathing. And when we saw the code changes coming in 2014, 15, 16, as they were evolving into requiring continuous insulation, we said, well, look, we have experience laminating materials to foam. That's what we were in the structures and panel business. So we knew that. So we thought this was an easy way for us to pivot, if you will, from selling sheathing to selling a system. We started in 2016 doing that and pioneering getting your first projects. We decided to go for large hotel projects as opposed to single house here or there, because those require a lot of prerequisites. And if you can do those projects successfully, that gives people much more confidence that you can do a house if you can do a $20 million hotel. So we were just cranking in 2019, just as the market was requiring, all the code officials were now requiring this stuff. They usually give it some little leeway to get it through the plan sets and get it into the next projects. But then COVID hits, right? And construction gets totally, shut down.
Yep.
And then in 2021, you had this supply chain disruptions that caused building materials to skyrocket, and the prices was incredibly volatile. And everybody put pencils down on their projects because they didn't know what their construction costs were going to be. So now we find ourselves back. So we thought we did nail it perfectly if COVID hadn't hit, but now we're back to where it's kind of a rational market again, and we're really growing.
How did you guys kind of endure some of those times, and also like that first deal? How did you guys get over the hump of getting the first deal? If somebody actually say like, yes, let's take this risk on this newer thing.
Took the right kind of person.
Yeah.
Right. But they were driven by the things that energy efficiency and the reality of how they're going to build in the wintertime. This was one in Chicago, and they're going to build starting in September. How are we going to build? And so it wasn't too hard for them to decide to do it. And we had already spent the money for the testing that was required and all of the road tax to get to that point where we had the product liability insurance in place and all of that. So it wasn't too hard for them to go, but it did take the right person. And now we've done dozens of projects, so you can look at all kinds of buildings and hospitals and hotels. So it's much easier for us now. But in the beginning, it took a lot of effort to be in the position to even go into that building.
Yeah.
But the value proposition we provided was sufficient to pay the guy back. And he was the person that made the $600,000 just because he was in 90 days early, right? So he was happy.
Yeah, that's huge. And so where do you think the future of sustainability is going in your eyes in terms of construction, and where you see kind of the world? Where would you see it looking in 10 years in terms of construction, buildings?
Well, for sure, the sustainability has hit construction. Most of the architects that are the specifiers are, millennials, and they're very aware of the environmental impact of things. So there's demand there a lot. So things like environmental product declarations, state of California, if you want to bid for a project, you have to have an environmental assessment of the total impact of your product in a nice, neat report. So those are definitely happening. There is, I think, a push on to design for waste. It makes no sense when you have things that go 4x8. So you can cut an 8-foot section into 2 feet very rationally. But if you want to cut it into 1 foot, 9 feet, for example, you can have some waste, or 9 foot, 6 3/4 inches, right? So there is, I think, a big push to start considering waste in the design elements of your buildings. There's a lot of push on design to create sort of, okay, I'm going to build a Model T, right? I'm going to build this kind of apartment complex that can be put into all these different places. And if I standardize the design and I do it rationally, I can lower the cost. So now my rent is affordable and I can drive costs down. So there's a lot of that innovation happening right now, a lot of money being invested in that. And products are being developed, right? And there's a lot of stuff flowing through the system right now that are using material science to increase energy efficiency, rationalize the constructability of buildings. We're one example of it. There's a lot of stuff out there. But what's driving it is the sustainability factor, reducing the carbon footprint of buildings, reducing the waste, increasing the energy efficiency. And codes are driving it. but the market's demanding it more and more.
Mm-hmm. So from your perspective, going through this whole construction career, essentially watching everything develop, why does it matter to you to actually build differently? Why has it always kind of been in the DNA to think about how to build differently? Was it just that one trip, or is there something that really draws you to it? Because I think that's also part of the innovation around the materiality is really the passion to solve the problem, not necessarily the opportunity. Totally
agree with you. I mean, I just looked at coming from a non-construction background, totally. Mm-hmm. I looked at construction and said, this doesn't, I mean, you have the materials that are out there right now, back in 20 years ago, were far better than what we were building with. Mm-hmm. Why are we still doing this, right? They say good judgment comes from experience, and experience comes from bad judgment, right? So when you start down this road and you say, hey, I've got a better way to do this, which I did, we built a company that had fiberglass sandwich panels to do structural insulated panel buildings. We won the fiberglass industry ACE award for the new technology of the year. We had Owens Corning and a number of Georgia Pacific as partners in this BASF in this effort. And yet when we got into the construction industry, nobody understood how to do a rivet or, build the way we were building, right? Even though the material was so much better. Mm-hmm. So I think for me, it was you just have to find a way to build more rationally. And the evolution of that was, but if you're going to get into the business, you better realize that the industry has a certain way of doing things, and you better fit into that, or you're never going to be successful as an enterprise. And so it was sort of that evolution. We built houses and projects out of every kind of system that we're big systems people, right? We believe in building systems as opposed to putting together pieces. And we've built out of every kind of material and system that you can. So we're big proponents of that whole concept. And that's been a driving force of us. Okay, how do we take what we've learned in this system that we saw, that we built with, and drive it forward into what we're doing now? And where is, everywhere you've traveled, everywhere you've been, where's your favorite place to enjoy nature? Love the mountains. So I'm a skier. So my favorite place would be on a powder day at the top of any mountain to enjoy nature. When did you start skiing? Oh, I grew up in Denver. So from the time I was 6. So oh my God. So you got the Rocky Mountain slopes that are kind of more home to you. Yeah, well, I lived in Reno, Nevada, near Lake Tahoe for a long time too. So that's my favorite places, are those types of places personally. So that's amazing. Well, how can people get more involved with Rok-On, reach out to you, learn more about the product? So our company's called Rok-On Building Systems. We didn't talk a whole lot about it today, but we have a website. It's rok-on.com. We make a product that's very hard and like rock-like, so we thought that was a good name for it. But Rok-On Building Systems, best way would be just to look at our website. We've got contact information there. If they have an interest, we'd love to talk to you about your building project and how we can help in a sustainable way, make it more sustainable and less costly. That's great. Well, and David, thank you just for taking the time to dive in on it. I know we didn't go quite as deep on Rok-On, but I think the idea of what you guys are working on and how it fits into the system and how it can actually make a huge impact, not only on current renovations that are going on or newer construction, whatever that may be. I think you guys are just in a really cool spot where you're innovating in a space that I think has needed it, but the way that you guys are doing it, I think is not only scalable, but it's solves the problem, which I think is what everybody's in search of. Correct. Well, it's a community of passionate people that are trying to make these changes. We're not unique, but we're pretty far along. But my hat's off to everybody who's putting the effort out to do it, because it's not the most economically rewarding thing in the beginning. It takes a lot of effort and energy to get there. And it's the passion to change the way we build and to have that impact on the environment. That's driving a lot of people, including us. And we're looking forward to seeing the innovations that come forward in the future. And we're going to be driving a big part of that, we hope. Awesome. Thanks, David. All right. Thank you very much. Thanks, Steve. Thank you for listening to the Sustainable Goat podcast. I'm your host, Steve Castanham. With each episode, we can further define what it means to create a truly sustainable and resilient future.
I think the new status is to show that you actually care. You want to drive change and you want to be part of a sustainable future.
People fight for what they love.
Let's really all start for a small but significant shift in the way we live, we consume, and we plan our life.
Join us at sustainablegoat.com.